Okay, I think we may as well start. For anybody who doesn't know me, I'm John Malloy. I'm a lecturer here at the college, but the main people who are going to speak today are Bernard Sweeney, who's a long-time traveller activist and the director of the Travision Media Group. Hopefully you'll be hearing a lot more about Bernard in the next while, so yeah, if Travision Media gets going, yeah. And beside him is Dylan Foley, who is an archaeologist, based in County Sligo, and with a special interest in kind of the history of colonisation in Ireland and traveller identity. So, without further ado, I think we'll go straight into it. The plan is that I'll kind of moderate this with a series of questions, and people will respond. We have a couple of slides and stuff here, so we can have an exploration of the themes of today. And then afterwards, when people are finished, we'll estimate it'll take about 40-45 minutes, and then we'll throw it open for questions and answers. Is that okay? Okay. So really, where we want to begin is kind of the present scenario of the travellers, and in a way, how come there's such a major difference between health outcomes, life expectancy, and so on for travellers as compared to the settled community in Ireland as of right now?
That's a question, isn't it?
That is a question, yeah. Why is the difference?
First of all, I'm slightly nervous, right? So, for a few things. It's not a kind of knock on me kind of thing. I didn't go to school. I school was very young. We always had an attitude towards the settled education system that if you talk long enough to a fool, you become a fool. That's what travellers believed about the settled education. They thought they were all educated fools. I know it's wrong now-ish, kind of. But my first experience at school when I was 5 years old. It was in Neil. It was in 5 miles from Ballinrobe, not far from here. And it was a big, massive school, and there was big, massive doors. And then there was a teacher, and she was about like 9 foot 7 inches, because I was 5 years old at the time. So that was the first time I seen the settled education system. When I walked into the classroom, I could see what I now remember because I watched a film called The Children of the Dam, where all these blonde-haired kids, and they're all in their uniforms, and they all were working together. So my first education experience with the settled community was I seen people who were very critiqued, very clean and tidy, uniform set, put their hands up, and all of this. So when I could see that, I must now think back, what kind of state must I have been in if this was classed as normal. So why I'm here is fundamentally important, tied into my life. History has a different meaning for different people. History I assume sometimes for a settled community is something that once happened a long time ago. History for an Irish traveller is something that constantly happening today. It's constantly repeated over and over and over. We see that through our health statistics. So it brings us to the health statistics. Some of these health statistics are a bit on the old side, but we didn't really matter where the health statistics were, either this day or 5 years ago or 4 years ago, because that's not the main concern we have. The main concern we have is why in 2019 are travellers dying younger than we were before the government intervention in 1963. So we have better health statistics, I think, in 1947 as we do in 2019. Now there has been improvements. There's been breaking down of discrimination, racism in parts. So we see that. There's access to education, we see that. But nevertheless, our mental health is getting worse. Most of our community do not make it past 40 years of age, let alone get to 65. That's an estimated life expectancy of travellers. So my concern always was that there was something not quite right. And that's compounded with the daily basis of racism you get as a traveller. You're inferior, you're from the famine, you're a failed settled person, you can't be educated, all of this combined. So you grew up with that. And I know my family grew up with that. I know the generation before that grew up with that. So that's a form of traumatization one way, that has never left our community, because it went from generation to generation. So our concern was, despite the fact that the government were investing some money, we can't just blame the government for everything on this, because some of it is actually not their fault. They were investing funding into travel organisations. You got Paddy Point, you got Irish Travel Movement, you got a lot of local travel organisations. But even with that, our health statistics are getting worse. We're committing suicide 7 times the national rate of the general population. That's in a country that already has a very high EU population of suicides. So again, it's tied into that. with the organisations, I'm not here to bash them or criticise them. I do have conflict at time to time with them. I'm trying to get my message out there, trying to give this perspective, which I grew up with. I can imagine now and look back in them days earlier when I was starting off, I was probably like a lunatic, running up with, I didn't have the vocabulary or explanation to explain what I was feeling or what I could see. But all of this is tied into this. So, yeah, and yeah, the life expectancy is attributed in the past with bad living conditions. And you could say that, yeah, well, you live in bad conditions, you're going to die young. Well, that makes sense. But even now, when we have got better living conditions, we're still dying younger. I think when we read that to 50. Yeah, so basically, the other thing that comes down to, and I know it's the awkward part for me to explain sometimes, is that what we have when I say settled mentality, and what we say when we have traveller mentality, and then there's a historical Irish mentality. We have a particular mentality in our culture that has lasted thousands of years, that has still stemmed into our community. Even though we don't speak the Irish language, and I know we're speaking the English language, but we feel more inclined to be Irish, and not because the various different definitions of Irish today, but that's who we were as a people. So I think that got kind of lost in transition. We then were seen as a group, and when you're seen as a group, you lose a lot of your rights, because they didn't recognize us as a people that had a history, that had land, that had property, that had castles, because everybody thinks the traveller community came from the famine. Others with various different groups, that were gypsies, that we came from different parts of the world. The irony of all of that is like we're pretty same complexion, and we had all the same surnames. But even at government level, they couldn't figure out who are the travellers. So yeah.
Maybe in relation.
Yeah, please, you keep interrupting me. I'll fire you.
Yeah.
Or you won't get a word in.
Yeah. Right. So I was going to say, like, similar to Bernard, coming from a different angle, but similar to Bernard. And I know it's just, I'm sure it happens in a lot of Ireland, especially when you're growing up. Not just when you're growing up, but also particularly when I would have been studying history. A bit like Bernard saying something's not quite right. I would have been aware of small, how would we put it? At first, small differences between the narrative that we're told and what really happened, or what was passed on to us from where we're from, particularly in the west of Ireland or in other pockets of the country that have certain ways of looking at things. There's certain peculiarities to do with the history, which I think we inherited. This is what one of the core things we want to talk about here is the difference in mentalities, as we're calling it, and the understanding. And this is related to any country that has a colonial past has a mindset. The colonization is not just physical; it's about a change in the way the world is looked at, and a lot of that has not been addressed in Ireland in relation to issues to do with travellers and other things. We see in America and other places where indigenous cultures are dealt with, it's more obvious that they're an indigenous culture perhaps at first, because the European invasion is obviously different. But obviously the same thing happened in Ireland. And actually, when you're studying it in history, in archaeology as I was, you also get interesting anomalies in the sense of, like, we use the county system because that's the official system of this state. We use the county system to understand Irish history. And quite often they'll make mistakes. Even when I was studying in the early 2000s, they would plot maps of castles or other objects like this onto maps that are actually the county maps and say how many castles are in County Sligo, for example. But the problem is, of course, that County Sligo didn't exist when these castles were built. The territories are completely different. So why would the modern state seek to understand a world that's a different world using the post-colonial mapping of the country, if you know what I mean? And this was not very well developed in Ireland in terms of trying to bring it back to why it is the way it is, if you know what I mean. To understand that the past was a different place in a sense. And the reason I'm saying that's probably linked here is that the health. Our question here would be: there's interventions by the state after independence, and we have a major intervention in 1963 when a report is made. And in some regards, they attempted to be positive by having changing the tack, like you'll see in the north of Ireland, for example, where it continues to be dealt with under vagrancy laws. Now, these laws go right back to Henry VIII's time, and that was the traditional method of the English state of dealing with people who moved around or anyone who was outside the system. They just put it under the general rule of vagrancy. And this was the attitude, someone who, they would deal with their own poor population in the same manner. The Irish state, in fairness, tried to sociologize it or medicalize it or something. I'm not sure how you'd say it. In 1963, they tried to have, that's okay. They tried to have a more advanced approach to it, a little bit. However, they made a committee, as we've talked about, they would make a committee with no traveller representatives on it, like zero. All farmers and other kinds of people.
Well, I think one of the things about the 1963 report was it was the first thing that Dylan actually recognised and saying, what's the very top of it, it actually said it did not set out to find out who the travellers were in an historical context. In other words, we have traumatised people here, but we're not going to find out what happened to them or where they came from. We're going to deal with it right here, right now.
Yeah.
The other part where I can understand a lot of travellers do themselves gets very kind of sour taste when it came to the 1963 report was because the mentality behind it, it even talked about how would the state identify travellers. In other words, they're going to give us particular tags, and this way then the guards will be able to track us down. This is 1963. 13 years before that, Hitler had the same thing with the German, or with the Jewish community. But they never broke over that concept. The reason it was turned down and rejected was because they couldn't afford the staff to carry it out. It wasn't because it was an evil thing to do. And again, they, in their own mindset, believed everything they were doing was right, it was good. It was somewhat questionable, of course. But yeah, I think even the 1983 report was such a follow-up, was the same thing with the history, wasn't it?
Yeah, so it is interesting that...
So there's been a whole series of interventions by the state, but the argument would be that these have all failed.
Well, the key, as we're saying there, the stats have got worse over years, and the relations between settled, I think most people would understand, the relations between settled and traveller community have actually got worse, and that's on the record. They would have been fairly reasonable in the early part of the century, quite often, especially in rural areas.
Yeah. So why would you think, Bernard, that this has failed?
This is where it gets kind of a little bit scary in one way, because, and I say it literally, because it's going to we can't get out of our position. We can never change this. We're absolutely powerless. And the truth is the settler community cannot get us out of this. The traveller community cannot get us out of this. And the only way we can get out of this is both sides come to find some kind of platform, a medium to talk. And the reason I say that is not because we rely on people with the skills, because they're very educated, because they're philosophers, because they've got PhDs and doctors and all that kind of stuff, lovely. But even if all of them combined 10 times more, they still cannot identify an issue that has historical roots. In other words, what I'm trying to say as an Irish traveller, we are not the outsiders. We're not the people that fell out of the sky. We're not the people that came from India. We are the Irish people. We are the Klan system. We are the old, ancient Ireland, and the settled community, which, better or worse, they accept it sooner or later, and I hope we all do, are the colonised subculture of Irish people. In other words, I know it's hard, but if you think about it, 1922, when the British left, nobody changed the education system, nobody changed the legal system, nobody changed the political system, nobody changed the landlord system, nobody changed the traditions and the trends and what it was to be British. So we hated the British, and this is not anti-British, because the British themselves have a very complicated history. They too were colonised. So we'd have to blame the Normans and the Saxons and the Vikings, and then we'll have to go find out what happened then. But we're taking it right here to Ireland. So when I say mentality, I'm talking about, we feel we have an Irish mentality, that our culture was once everything Ireland was about. If you go back far enough to the Brehon laws, we're still practicing elements of Brehon law in our community today, but we didn't know what Brehon law was, because we had been denied an education for so long. So we had people telling us that we're gypsies and we're tinkers and we're this, that and the other. We knew we weren't, but we didn't have the means to prove who we were. So when we see the 1963 report where it says it deliberately leaves out history of travellers, because if that had to go into the history, maybe there could have been a different approach. And that's why I think it's important we have these conversations, as difficult as they might be at times.
So do you think that the legislative framework that the Irish state now has can be compared to the colonial framework of the English state, let's say back in the Tudor period, that kind of idea? Do you think there's a comparison possible there?
I think so, yeah. Let's see now, do we have anything else? Where are we? What's that?
Just, yeah.
Okay, so Yeah, absolutely. And you could go through that. You could go, because we're dealing again with two things: the structure of the system itself.
Yeah.
Where did that come? Understand where that came from, and the mindset, as Bernard's talking about there, like a different mentality of understand. A completely different understanding of what it is to be civilized, or what it is to organise a society.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. So obviously the Irish state, as Bernard was saying, in 1922, the Irish state would have inherited essentially the nuts and bolts of the British state, which is fine as far as it goes. But like we said, no accommodation was made, or no attempt was made to understand, well, what are the problems we are now dealing with that we've inherited because of this history, whether it be famines or any other forms of colonialism. And actually, we have a further slight issue in the sense that what we're trying to say here is that the problems, why would it get worse even when the Irish state intervenes in a way that's positive? So if you make a report in 1963 and another one in 1983 and another report here and there and interventions and all the rest of it, why would statistics get worse, and why would conflict get worse? Well, I would assume that history might give us an answer, in the sense that the state itself was constructed to destroy Irish life, essentially, to destroy that way of thinking and to destroy the mode of life. So many things in Irish society were pretty much the exact reverse of the English society at the time. So if we go back to the actual period of conquest, is the 16th century, and the plans laid out by people like Edmund Spencer and others like this are actually specifically target movement of people in the country. Movement is seen as one of the central core things of Irish society. The society is let me give one example of the exact reverse of English society in terms of its mentality. An English society and European society of the time, the mainstream society, would regard that if you had a bricks and mortar and a fixed house, that was a rich person. Irish society is the exact opposite of that, in the sense that the poorer you were, the more fixed to the land you were, and the richer you were, the more likely you were to be mobile and to have horses and to have that kind of mobility. The state that was constructed throughout the 17th century is the state that was inherited in 1922, and that every part of the law was designed to prevent motion, to prevent the move, even down to things like I marked there. The plan to our roads with the hedgerows along the sides of them, the fences, all of this was planned on purpose to stop the movement of large herds of cattle and horses, strings of horses, and to stop the movement of clans of essentially warriors and things like this.
Similar process like the enclosures in Scotland and so on.
Exactly, because the land in Ireland was fairly open up until the early 17th century.
I think you'll expect why they got the mentality to critique the way it was, because when the conquest had started up, they started building up colleges. It would be Trinity College, Maynooth College, all these various colleges. Probably never get called back to the college again after this. But it's not that. They implemented it in that way. So the idea was, even before that, even the Catholic Church, they made a deal. Look at it. You can practice your cultures, you can practice your religion, but you have to do it in English. You have to go to an English school. So now you're thinking in English. Your philosophy is around English. Your thoughts, everything now is an English mentality. So when you come out of that, you see the world through the lens of an English mentality. So it's a bit like when people go to organizations, how organizations change people. And they've changed since they went with that group or that group. Same thing, that was a process that went on for quite a while.
So like, there's a certain amount of DNA evidence that shows that the travellers kind of separated out somewhere in the 16th century. So fundamentally the argument is that the travellers are kind of rooted in this older clan culture that somehow survived the colonisation process. I'm just trying to spell it out.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So the tradition, they would understand it that way. DNA evidence allows us to sort of we try to lock it down a little bit, because before this we'd only have circumstantial evidence of, say that the travelling community is definitely an Irish community and that kind of thing. So we know now that it's without doubt that they're coming from related or come out of an Irish population.
Yeah.
The latest DNA evidence as well would find a separation, you're correct, at about 400 to 400 and odd years ago, which is exactly what we'd expect.
Yeah.
But we're going to try to reverse this in the sense of understand this in reverse, because the normal interpretation and what really is the key issue here that confuses a lot of the conversation about this is we imagine as the settled community, we project back that we've always been the same as we are. But the problem is the separation is the exact reverse.
Yeah.
What we would say is travellers are not separating from the rest of the settled community and become a subculture. It's that the settled community begins as the subculture and gradually expands across the whole of the country. Yeah. Now, there had always been an Anglo-Irish culture in the cities, in Dublin and in those towns. And it's that culture that benefits mostly from the conquest. And it's that culture that benefits from enclosure and whose laws are expanded across the country, gradually encroaching more and more upon up until that point, the vast majority of the country lived under the Brehon law and lived on open land, didn't live in stone houses, and was mobile to some extent, apart from those that were, as I said, fixed to the land to some extent. You know. So yeah, we have a split, but it's not the way we think, the way we think about it.
And would that ring true for you, Bernard, just in terms of the way you were being brought up?
Well, this exactly is, because I know it's so difficult to explain, because I'm sitting in here in a structure in a building everybody's familiar with. You know, this is society, you grew up around it. But even for me, it's not that I'm dissociated from the greater external world. We do see things differently, we behave differently. Our ethnicity is defined by our mentality, our culture is defined by our mentality. So we've got culture traits that came from our mentality. If the settled community resembled more of a British culture, and again, this is just something we have to look into, and have that language, have that mentality, and see travellers the exact same way as the British seeing the Irish overall. Exact same thing. So the savages, the barbaric, the fighting, all of this was the concept coming from Dublin. And outside Dublin, outside the Pale they call it, with a very small Pale starting up, but everybody outside of Dublin were cultures. Like, it wasn't just the Mayo people or the Sligo people. Everybody. You could be in Kildare, you're a culture. And this was the kind of thing they're going was, I suppose in some ways, I suppose some of the settlements that came here probably came with the belief they were coming into a world of savages and they were going to help them out in some way. I partly believes that happened. But yeah, it's that constant projection. That's our interpretation of it, because we always knew who we were, and we would see this settled-ary education, this settled-ary world very similar to the people who came here and actually destroyed the land.
I mean, you have figures like Walter Raleigh would compare the wild Irish with the Native Americans, even as late as, let's say, 1620, you had Richard Jobson. He was an early explorer, and he went to the Gambia, and he was exploring up the Gambia River, and he started comparing the local people there to the Irish rhymers and wandering minstrels, which is effectively the travellers. So, comparing this. So there was very much this kind of colonial exploration and stereotyping of the people who were other.
This is my theory, my feeling on it. When we see things about racism, when we think about identity, national identity, political identity, and all kinds of different identities, is that, for me personally, I feel that the bulk of that came from colonisation. Because if you take Ireland again as an example, we were experimented in great deals, would it be pushed into the education system, would it be transported, would it be slaves, whatever it might be. A lot of work went into Ireland. So, and again, it's not taking anyone else away from anyone else. But when the comparisons with Native Americans, we have almost identical health statistics of the Native Americans. We have the same problems that the Native Americans have with that mentality, the American mentality, which is a European mentality, which was a colonized mentality, which was experimented here in Ireland. So when we look at Australia, New Zealand, America, think of mentality in one way as almost like a neurological disease, and it started here and somehow and has spread through the countries. The indigenous populations, not to mention the environment, have been crushed and destroyed with this mentality. And there's no way can they get out of it, because when you're in it looking out, you don't realize that you're in. You actually think you're on the outside looking in, or looking out. There is, and the same with African Americans. If you look at the same statistics, look at how we were segregated. After the 1963 report, you set up a traveller children's home, just for traveller children. One for the boys, one for the girls. It went through it was described afterwards as the House of Horrors. So we can imagine what went on with a children's home in Ireland in the 70s. This was travel-only children. No settled children could go in there. We had our own buses. We had our own classrooms. We couldn't go in the same time as a settled person did the service. We had to go at particular times. So that segregation happened, which was identical to what happened in America. And again, same mentality, same colonial outlook. And everybody else is the savages and so on and so forth.
If we go back to the kind of history thing and the idea of family names and the clan system and so on, do you think there's, again, more evidence for this kind of stuff in the particular family names that are commonly found in the traveller community?
Yeah, yeah, of course. The names are, well, firstly, the names are mostly Irish. They're not entirely Irish.
Not entirely, yeah.
No,
this is
some
one
of
the
them
reasons, yeah.
Yeah, so, well, in our areas, well, we one here in Mayo, actually, that isn't necessarily Irish. It's Welsh, it's Barrett.
Yeah.
Yeah. But a common factor across all of them is that, like you said, about different, I'd say it's fairly random as to who's left to some extent, except that what we're dealing with is, again, a society that was very, different. And another reversal between, say, like mainstream European society and Irish society is that Ireland was what we call a warrior or a martial aristocracy. So the military, a bit like samurai or that, were ones in charge of society. Merchants were at the very bottom of the society pile, okay? And in a society like that, it means that it's a large amount of the clans are martial in origin. And it's particularly it is true that we get particularly clans with military associations, like Sweeney.
Yeah, so Sweeney would be a Galaglas name, and then some of the others would be Kerns, which were kind of the indigenous warriors.
Professional soldiers of some sort.
Yeah.
Galaglas in particular are professional soldiers.
Yeah.
But we also have families that are ecclesiastical in origin, like Mahon, I think. They were, it was hereditary for clans to look after ecclesiastical land. Yeah. And some of them are from that background, and it's not necessarily martial as...
with poetic and musical families like Wards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Macon Ward is the son of the bard, and families like this that are attached in various sort of constellations of clans that Bernard could probably describe better than me.
I think, some way when you think about the traveller community, I suppose we'll rewind the clock back and throw a big colonisation bomb in the middle of everything, and those closest to it gets more affected. Yeah. Those who are in the scattered or were away from it a bit further still have that kind of Irish identity. We're sharing the same English language now, so we're consciously aware about this mentality. So with that, it wasn't the case that we were always one community. We were sometimes warring tribes, but we were a bit like direct division. How you got a multitude of different cultures, different communities locked up, banged up here in Ireland. Pretty much like that. Everybody says the asylum community and this kind of stuff, because it's easier to get in this kind of
box.
One box, yeah. Tribal communities are diverse now. But one down the southern part, they would have they call it Gammon. We call it Cant. So basically, it's the same language, a couple of tweaks here and there, but that existed down there. The same way when the Irish travellers went to America 200 years ago. To this day, and they're the only Irish people in America to ever be called Irish travellers. Everybody else is called Irish Americans. Everybody else has that kind of, but 200 years are still Irish travellers. Same in other parts of the world, and it's just a culture retaining, I suppose.
We'd have a decent cross-section of old Gaelic society represented by traveller names, including even English, like Lawrence.
The other thing I'd like to mention briefly is about, and this is kind of a traveller perspective in one way, is that when we have cousins coming back from Scotland or Wales or England, we don't see them as our Scottish, English, Welsh cousins coming to visit us. We don't bring in the political nationality. The nationality has nothing to do. Who you are has nothing to do where you're born, as far as we're concerned. It's who you are as a community. So even if you're a rivalry clan, we don't say the Scottish travellers or the English travellers. They have their own identity now because they are indigenous from them, and their indigenous are shaped out much the same as Irish travellers.
If we try and kind of look at the origins of the hostility towards travellers, I mean, one line of thought that has been raised is the idea that, during the Cromwellian period, that the travellers' crocks, as they were known as at the time, would have been used as kind of a buffer between the increasingly being colonised Irish and the English forces. Do you think there's any validity in that kind of idea?
Sorry?
The idea of the crocks, where the Cromwellian forces, they used travellers to kind of disrupt and raid cattle for people who are more settled already, but they used it as kind of a battering ram against...
Well, it's one of those things, in the same way where they brought Irish to various parts of the world and then they killed people they never met.
Yeah.
You know, it's the kind of thing when you get in, you're conditioned. You're talking about 1800s?
No, it's the 1640s.
1640s, yeah. Well, it's been around that time, I suppose. And again, it's one of those things. People didn't reject colonisation, didn't run away from it, think it was the worst thing in the world. For a lot of people who were already struggling probably in another society, thought it was a wonderful opportunity to have land, houses, and so on and so forth.
What I would say is well, firstly, some professional soldiers are professional soldiers. So the Queen always employed gallowglass. I'll be honest about that. But also,
I wasn't trying to hide it, mate.
No, but it would be difficult in the chaos of the 1640s to really understand. Yeah. That was so bad at that stage that the entire society was uprooted and actually banded together. The groups banded together. They used to call them queriot or crates, isn't it? Yeah. They used to band together into very large groups for survival because the place was actually riddled with armies at the time. There was armies of every sort. You know, the confusion of that War of the Three Kingdoms or whatever. I don't think you would see. I think that it would be worth exploring something in terms of like martial aristocracies are not necessarily popular, even in the society beforehand if you're a peasant. You know what I mean? Okay. Yeah. But having said that, Irish clans, the system in general and the people in general more or less stuck together as far as I could see. Yeah. The likelihood of it stemming from something to do with Cromwell wouldn't be likely because...
So when would you
because
see
later on,
possibly beginning?
Well, because later on in the 18th century, you get many descriptions of people who were marginalised. Now, those who have knowledge of the past, the historians, this is why the Harpers were being hung, for example. The poets were particularly targeted by legislation. Yeah. And so was any movement was under martial law too. And you could be picked up, I think you had 3 strikes and you could be executed if you were found just moving in this country.
In 2002, the Irish state brought out what we call an apartheid law, where it was only ever used against travellers, and again, around mobility. So a couple of 100 years ago, this is what the English were doing to the Irish. Now we have the Irish doing it as civil.
Yeah, well, that's exactly the thing, that the state unconsciously replicates the past in that sense, but that's what we're trying to establish.
There is elements where, through the famine, of course, people were devastated, people were kicked out, people took to that similar life as well. But if you go close enough to that, the mentality base, you're talking about very close to a Gaelic Ireland anyway.
Yeah. Well, what I would give as an example, and what I would answer your question about the 1640s, I would say that by in the 18th century, there's quite a lot of records of people. You see, they're called a different name by that stage. Yeah. So the English have established a society across the country, not just the English, the Dublin Anglo-Irish have established a system of landlordism across the country. That's fine. They've built the roads, they've blocked the travelling, that's fine. But there's still a large proportion of the population that are marginalised for various reasons. And what I was saying a minute ago was that obviously poets, historians, and military are particularly anathema to the new system. And you'll get complaints on the record. There are many complaints of either them being the old Tories, the old rebels, various people like that. They're out there. But also there are complaints in particular, and I haven't got a quote there, but complaints from English landlords saying that the farming people, are supporting their old gentry, as they call them, and their old associations with families of poets or historians or martial families who have no land of their own and are marginalised by the new system, are still being supported by the peasantry, is what the English are complaining about. Yeah. And so we have on the record many complaints of this nature, which shows that actually the old relationships are still there. Yeah. And that probably the animosity, it's not so marked as you would say, and it's unlikely to have come from the time of the 17th century.
So is there any way we can kind of pinpoint when the animosity began and why? That would be kind of the core question.
Well, they came from Dublin when they thought everybody outside Dublin were savages and barbaric. That's the truth. If you believed that and said that, but then belief spreads. If you colonise the next bunch, everybody in Kildare thinks the next county.
Bernard would be correct. I think after the famine in particular, I think the adoption of what would have been an attitude in the Pale of here be wild Irish and that kind of attitude, I think that the spread of that attitude into the countryside has occurred over the 20th century. Yeah. And some of it has occurred, because that culture is more and more, that attitude is more and more penetrated. Maybe not totally, I can't say on purpose entirely, but it's become the dominant attitude, and it probably, as Bernard says, literally a transfer of that attitude. It would have been a minority attitude in certain parts of the country, in the towns in particular.
Yeah. I mean, the towns, like, it is important for people to realise that a lot of the towns in Ireland are actually relatively new. So a lot of the urbanisation of Ireland happened in the 19th century.
Yes.
So in that sense, that mentality would become much stronger in the 19th century.
Yeah, and it would have been an urban mentality, because the towns like the walled towns, the old ones like Dublin, Kilkenny, Waterford, Cork, had always been loyal to the Crown.
And they had Irish towns outside the walls.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, and again for rural Ireland, and a prime example, when I think it was the National Development Plan was being put together, you forgot about the Northwest. You forgot about Mayo, Sligo, and their country. How did your capital of the country forget 5 or 6 counties? Did not come into the concept. And then lately we had another guy who was saying that we can no longer afford rural Ireland. In other words, it's rural Ireland's own fault for being poor.
Yes.
That's that attitude. That's the mentality.
So we could widen that out and say exactly.
It's
not just about the same symptoms occur across the board in terms of attitudes to rural Ireland, which are essentially the same. They've been transferred as well. As if rural Ireland is actually is a kind of a code word for beyond the pale, really. And that's that same mentality, that it's like not a place that's any point investing in because it's developmentally backward and there's nothing you can do.
So if we want
the
to
Irish
talk,
language would suffer too.
If we want to talk about mentalities, I mean, how would you feel, what's kind of the core difference between, let's say, a traveller mentality and a settled mentality from your own experience?
I suppose when you look at our health statistics, and when you look at the way travellers have been treated, and it's not, again, to play victim and travellers or this, that,
Sorry.
The reason I'm attributing is because the language we speak, a lot of people assume that we always had this language. And sometimes, I don't know if I'll actually be laughing, but sometimes I even hear the racists saying, no, if the foreigners want to live in Ireland, they have to speak English. That in itself is such a contradiction. Like, you're asking somebody else to come to your country and speak somebody else's language. So that's the mentality. We assume this English mentality or this English language was always there. And it's not anti-English, and I want to keep saying that part. So we adapted that framework, that mindset. Every thought, every fibre in the body, every emotion, every feeling we ever could have, we could describe them through the English language. We couldn't describe them to any other language. We didn't have words for it. So that mentality is a colonised mentality that came pretty much from Dublin as a result of the British conquest. So yeah, it's more of a British mentality, English mentality than it is an Irish one, and that's where we have the conflict. Now, saying that, I'm not saying that every settled person in the country is colonised and they have an English mentality. You must understand the complexities in itself of the settled community. If you go back far enough, most of them already came from England. They already had set up shop here. They were part of a colony. They were like second, third generation English, you could say. So that suited him to keep that system and keep that mentality. And everybody else then was a bit like where Christianity accuses everybody who's not Christian as paganism. They were doing much the same thing. Anybody who wasn't part of this mentality is a savage. And they broke it down eventually and then psychologically. And they drive people to the point where it's, you go with it or you're going to die. And that's why we see those statistics today.
Like a lot of settled people, I think, would see traveller culture as kind of a debased form of Irish culture. And yet I think a lot of travellers would see the exact reverse. Well, there's a tension there. Like, I mean, let's say just things around food, cleanliness, those kind of issues.
Well, oddly enough, the food and cleanliness comes from, we could be living in a pigsty. Everyone knows that travellers have a particular hygiene, so they've got particular basins for washing their hands, they've got particular basins for washing food. You can't mix the two of them. If you do accidentally, one gets dumped. Now, this could be in the middle of a swamp, and that could be in anywhere. And then we're renowned for putting the prices of bleach up, because all the travellers love the bleach. So there's an element of that. So the hygiene is there.
I know, like often when travellers go to a settled house, they'll only eat food they can peel.
Yeah, there's a lot of that changing too.
But I mean, that's
years ago when I was growing up, we had the handyman. And he was the loveliest person in the world. He died a few years ago. A lovely human being. And one day we're down the front garden of our house, and we're chatting away, my father and my brother. So the father said to my youngest brother, "What would ask your mother is such a person's dinner ready?" So my younger brother came down and he wouldn't say nothing. He was just like this here. He had a message to tell, but he was too afraid to say it. So my father looked at him eventually 15 minutes. Did I not ask you to go up and ask your mother to ask, is your man's dinner ready? She said she can't find these dirty plate and cup. It wasn't that they were dirty, it's because they had specialised cups and plates for the settled people. And if the settled person used it, the travel family wouldn't use the same cup and plate then. So it just gives you kind of reverse hygiene, how we thought the settled people were dirty. So that's what, with embarrassing moments like that lots of times.
Yeah, but just these are cultural differences that people often don't realise. That's, I suppose, is fair.
It would be very difficult for the settled community to see traveller culture. Because for one, we have the same complexion. Two, we live in Ireland. We've got the same miserable climate. So it's very difficult to see the mentality behind that. And again, it also goes with that, a sense of feeling, belonging. Like I mentioned earlier on, when travellers come from different parts of the world, we don't see the political labels, we see the people. So there is that community sector. In the settled mentality, I sense there's a great deal of individualism. And it's all about the I, the me, give me your number one, and all this kind of stuff, and I'll make everything better. When a traveller, it's about we. Same with an insult. You don't insult one person, you insult everybody. So we have that kind of, it works. So, I think the other part where the travellers we're caught in almost, not a time loop or something, but we're caught in something. Because we've been submerged at this stage with a settled-ary environment, a settled-ary world. So we're locked into that. And that's why I honestly, truly feel, unless we can unlock that and come to terms and understand it better, we'll continue to see a lot of traveller suicides, and eventually there won't be no travellers. That's a given. The NGOs do a lot of good work. They treat symptoms. We're trying to say in some way we might have found possibly the source to a lot of problems in our community, and indeed a global context.
So ultimately what you're saying is really that until we come to terms with this kind of post-colonial history, we can't really solve any of these kind of issues.
Well, I'll give you an example. My own child wasn't great. I went to school, got a few slaps and kicks and thumps from teachers and put it back to school. Last when I mentioned about college and stuff like that. So I went through that part. But I know my father grew up a very tough life. His father was murdered. It was my grandfather. I feel guilty for his death because I didn't go out of time and asked him to come in because he was fond of drink, because his wife had died in the fire with 3 of his children. So there was debt, misery on both sides of my family. Their family had the same thing. Their family had the same thing. So we've never been out of that trauma state. Right back for hundreds of years. The part where we're finding difficulty is the settled community are actually living in denial anything happened. And it's a very common day speech when you keep saying to people, that was yesterday, forget about it. That's history, that's ancient. Forget about it, forget about it, forget about it. But if you keep forgetting about it, that means you know anything about it. And again, with the Irish history as a subject, it's kind of strange in one way when we walk into a country and they're debating whether or not they dump their own history. So
you said that denial is could be a sign of trauma in itself.
Also, we're not the only ones trauma. Look at where our conflict, our physical conflict, is that we can't get to housing, we can't get into service, and blah 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 blah, all that kind of stuff. That's a physical aspect of it. So that's not going to change unless the settled community come to realization. And this is not just for travellers. And we unlock this. It isn't just, we're happy days. We know our history is good. This will help rural Ireland. It will help a lot of people. I genuinely feel that has issues, psychological issues. People in the social world now, they say to people, they don't say, what's wrong with you? Because that's kind of, you don't say it in social settings anymore. In the profession, they ask, what happened to you? And now this is seen as the new way to approach mental health. Don't ask them what's wrong with you, ask what happened to you. But we're saying most people don't even know what happened to them. Most people have traumas that went from one generation after another. In the same way certain people hand down traditions, same way traumas. And that has been pushed down, kept down. And everything about our past is meant to feel bad and ashamed. It's dark. And the same way to treat current situations in the state. You know, it's a dark chapter in life. That's the way people thought back then. But if we push forward and take another step back, we say, look, there's 100,000 people homeless. We're locking up people based on their skin colour and their socio-economical. You know, we go 20, 30 years back further, we'll be looking back what mentality was at play there. My point overall is that mentality has not changed since the 1600s. We're as well to be living in the 1600s because that's the exact same treatment in some ways psychologically we're getting today.
So that needs to be resolved fundamentally, and how do we resolve that?
Well, quite honestly, even if I had the answer, I'm not quite sure because I would say them.
There we are.
There is room. There is absolutely room how we could all come to terms with this. And again, it's about engagement, it's about conversations, it's about talk. I said earlier on, settled community can't do it for themselves. We can't do it for ourselves. The only way we can do it is doing with each other. And I'm sensed this, and I really have a strong feeling. But when we peel that layer of dark history away from us, we'll see a very rich, beautiful Irish culture, and not just Irish. Irish wasn't first for the Irish. This is nonsense to hear people talk about. Irish is always a diverse multitude of people, and that includes the Protestants. That's going to include the different religions, the Catholics. It's not about any of that stuff. It's about a history where we once had a very sense of humanity, I suppose.
Yeah. Okay, we're kind of on the time now. Will we have a look at Oriole Moore?
Oh, there he is.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about him?
I was just going to, there's one or two pictures there.
Yeah,
and actually, this is a picture from the time we're talking about.
Yeah.
This is an etching that was done by Lord
John Derrick.
John Derrick, yes.
Yeah.
I think it was commissioned by Deputy Henry Sidney, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So that's during the beginnings of the colonial. You could actually say the beginning of the British Empire in a sense.
Yeah.
It starts in Laois and in Offaly. The very first attempt to colonise beyond the Pale, in the kind of modern sense of a colony, where they build what's now Portlaoise, which is at that time called Fort Protector.
Yeah.
Now, I just wanted to say a couple of things about that, in the sense that there's a guy standing in a hedgerow looking miserable. He's even got these Latin tags beside it, say "I am really miserable now" type stuff. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is there's two elements to that. Firstly, this is propaganda in a sense.
Yeah.
The whole point of this commission was, and they didn't even have the technology to do these etchings in England at the time. I think it was done in Holland or somewhere. Sidney had commissioned a whole series of these to say how wonderful a job he'd done in Ireland. And this image is, as we say, and you had said to me, was it that it was like, what are we talking about here, first traveller type of thing?
Yeah.
Well, in one sense, you would be correct in one sense, in the sense that this picture is designed, it's kind of the beginning of what you asked earlier, of like this attitude that we're talking about. It's not the full beginning of that kind of thing against the Irish. Obviously, that goes back to the 12th. But the beginning of the modern sense of targeting people like that by saying, here's an image. What it's saying is, this is how we want you to think about these people. Yeah. If you know what I mean. So here he is, miserable in a hedgerow with a blanket wrapped around him. Yeah. But the reality of that is that in England, from the Dublin point of view, or I'm going to say the state's point of view, the early Irish state, that's the kind of thing they want us to believe about people who are beyond the pale. Okay, and what it's about him. But the reality of who this man is that he's actually, this is Oriole Moore, dies about 1578, I think. Oriole Moore had been leading the resistance against the colonisation of what became Queen's County, the very first plantation. And Oriole Moore is actually the king of Laois, the 7 sets of Laois, isn't he? And as far as I understand, the O'Moores and the kings of Laois were the marshals for the kings of Leinster, and therefore had a military tradition. And that military tradition meant that they'd been, I think at that stage, since the 1540s, the war had been on and off since the 1540s until this point.
And they were actually forced for quite a long time after this as well, for generations after this.
Yes, it continues for another century. Yeah. And actually, the fighting in Laois had gone on for 60 years, even by the early 1600s. But I suppose the important thing to realise is that from an Irish point of view, from an Irish mentality, this man was recognised as the king of Laois.
He was a leader.
Yes, and had defeated many armies put into the field by them. But on the other side of it, what's interesting about the picture is that it's the beginning of how we're being told how to look at this man from the other mentality, if you know what I mean. The one that's going to eventually become the one that we're now more familiar with now.
A miserable savage and beggar and all that stuff.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's what you get in 2019 when you look at the papers, when they talk about travellers, about barbaric trading and robbing, stealing, and all this negative, this is propaganda. Same stuff. And this is what we're talking about mentalities. Yeah. Behind this picture is a history of Irish warriorism and bravery and so on and so forth. Yeah. But the British mentality are trying to get everybody else to look at it as a beggar, trampish, thiefish, this kind of that's mentality shift.
One other picture before that one there. Just to point out, you see that's Carrickfergus there. So there's an English town in about 1560, a new town being built, like as you described on the left. Yeah. And all those little, you see the little, theirs are all little huts there. There's all the little Irish houses.
Yeah, up on the top there,
Yeah. So that's the Irish settlements around the town, as we described. and the English buildings, and then of course there's a
still surviving the same
type of dwellings.
You see, tents, when the Klan system has been broken down, most of the warriors were using them tents anyway.
Yeah.
That was the way of travelling.
Yeah.
Same thing when people say about travellers don't have land, travellers were always nomadic. That's not very true. Even when we did have land, even when we did have castles, we were still nomadic, because that's the way our system worked. You survived by being nomadic. As Dylan explained earlier on, if you were in a house, you weren't, but there's some good quality.
Just move on circuits, and the circuits are described in the whole.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. I think we'll leave it at that. Is that all right?
That's perfectly fine. Yeah.
Thanks very much to Bernard and Dylan, first of all. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody, any questions or comments or anything?
Just quickly, briefly.
Sure.
Steph and Dylan at the moment are, we've been I've been doing this all my life. I don't get paid for it, but we still be doing it. But we're also at the moment working on a history book. And we're also working on a documentary around the 1963 report. And I know sometimes I get upset about this kind of stuff, and I find it difficult to communicate, because I'm not talking about history, I'm talking about people in my life. Even if it was 300 years ago, I still feel their pain. Same when we see Carrick Mines and stuff like that, and we see how the state didn't provide supports. This is not just that family, that's how we all feel. That's how we feel against the state and how we've been treated. But we're hoping to get away from particular style of mentality, the traveller, the settled, this group, that group, and we're going to just bring it back and say, look guys, Protestant, Catholic, Saxon, Anglo, traveller, I don't know who you guys are genetically, we'll find out sooner or later. But it's a great meeting place. I think somewhere like Travision. I think that sometimes I've scared people in the past when I tried to explain this colonisation to them, because either they didn't want to hear it, didn't know what to do with it anyway. If they did, I had people say to me, well, what did the professionals say? And I had people on national radio say, well, we wouldn't even know where to start with a conversation like that. So you've got difficulties. I've been out on that side for a very long time. I fell out with the organisation for the same thing. So we have the documentary, the book, and a few other bits and pieces. And I suppose in a nice possible way I'm trying to say also is that we really, really need kind of support and investment into Travision. And you'll see a different Ireland through the lens of travellers, and a very more positive one for Ireland overall.
Okay, so anybody want to ask any questions or anything?
Presumably there's a lack of education in schools in Ireland about the history of the traveller population. And I was wondering if part of that might be because the traveller community doesn't have an established written history, it's more of an oral history. Is that correct? That it's
not really
written down as much as histories of other cultures?
I'll just say first, there is this thing where it's believed that travellers have an oral history, and of course we do elements of that. That's our history. Everything you see up there, Rory Moore, that's our history. That's how we live. That's how we still kind of live in some ways. So when people say traveller history, the settled history, the settled is a mentality. You could be, it's nothing to do with genetics. It doesn't matter where you're born. You could be born in England, Scotland, Wales, but if you have a particular mentality, that's what becomes the norm. So we do, I suppose Dylan will tell us about some of the written stuff like...
Well, I'd say that it's been an interesting one, and there was documentaries done recently which are where they ask who are the travellers and questions like this. But I mean, the reality is if you understand it as just as Irish history in general, so we have a society up until the 16th century that is made of clans. Okay, the whole society is organised in that manner. We have the history of that society going back another 1,500 years to about the 6th or 7th century AD. Okay? So we have a long written history. Of course, oral history was always very important in Ireland as well, parallel to that. But we actually have, and it was written just up the road here. I can't afford it because it's 800 quid. If anyone wants to sponsor me, right? The Book of Genealogies was written up the road at the Lecca by MacFurbisher, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so he was a historian working for the O'Dowds. Actually, during the Cromwellian conquest, he was in Galway and places like this trying to write it. He actually writes at one stage, the armies are moving west. And he's in a hurry to write down the genealogy. But the genealogy of the tribes and clans, and he actually includes, because he's a professional, he includes, I think, the Normans and English and everybody who comes into the country. Everyone gets treated in this. it's not correct to say that we don't that there is no written history. It's actually the complete opposite. But we have to connect traveller history. You have to connect it to Irish history as a whole. The settled community, the split then under the colonial system is where they start. One of the ways that colonialism works is it splits people from their history on purpose. So it cut the connection between it. For example, in County Sligo there was several little territories, and the O'Haras were chiefs of one. The MacDonaghs, for example, were chiefs of Chirelia. They eliminated Chirelia, for example, rolled it together with a couple of other territories, called it County Sligo, and then it didn't matter that there was 1,000 years of kings of Chirelia called MacDonaghs, okay? Because if he tried to claim it, it said, well, there's no such territory here. There's County Sligo. That's all we know.
So it's all about property and land in terms of the fact that the settled community based everything around permanence of property.
Yes.
And the traveller community is completely different. So is that why it's like square in the circle? One is round and one is square, and there's no way of adapting to that?
Well, you can talk about that in a second, but what I'd say very quickly is that it's difficult when you're within an environment of the law that was set up to make you think that way, in a sense, if you know what I mean. In other words, the colonial thing was very much bothered about, it was the land they wanted, if you know. That's the whole point on it, if you know what I mean. To give title to the land and to dislocate those that might have been on the land earlier, and to marginalise them and their claims, and to claim that it didn't exist, if you know what I mean. So, well, yeah, the way that I was just going to say that in the modern, what it begs the question is what you were saying, what do we do about it now? Yeah. Which it would be that we would have to address issues of law, yes, at some point. And it doesn't mean we should go back to the past, we don't want to do that entirely. But what we have to address is that we recognise that not just in terms of travellers, but in terms of other, they're the most emergency because we have literally people suffering right now. But the law was never addressed. The idea, when there was a revolution in the country, the ideals of the revolution included Celtic revival, included Bretton law, included addressing or recognising at least that this dislocation had happened. It then got countermanded and it was not spoken about. And we just say that has to be spoken about in order to create a little bit of space and to say that if does Ireland as a whole want to allow room for that older ways of life that included, you know, keeping horses, that included connection, different ways of moving around on the land, or different ways of ownership. Collective ownership of clans of land is the standard in Ireland. And is it possible for this state to accommodate that to some extent, or does it want to? You know, that kind of thing. Would be some of the questions that come up, isn't it?
Well, yeah. Again, I think we have a particular narrative at the moment, and we have a pretty good relationship. He's the settled historian. I'm the loose cannon traveller. But I have a sense of mentality history where I come from, and this guy has great context in putting ways and so on and so forth. The other thing I'll point out, and sometimes I feel I don't want to go down the road of conspiracy theory and all that kind of stuff, but with the 1963 report, when he deliberately left out the history of these people, because it would have revealed a whole lot more, they decided then later life to give us the ethnicity recognition, and that was to in some way make us feel better. Some of us were very critical of it because we believed it would make things worse. Because now they were given a label that was both incorrect and wrong, and they were also not telling people their history. So now we were identified as being this indigenous ethnic group. Symbolical recognition of our ethnicity, quite a mouthful. But basically, ethnic group means people without a land. So Roma, Gypsy, which are wonderful cultures, are people that they don't have to stake the land, so they move. We're saying that travellers are not an ethnic group, we're an indigenous ethnic group. In other words, we did have land, we were here. We did live off this mentality of Irishness and have spread from one generation to the next. The rest of the settled population became more colonised. And again, this is not to ridicule people like that, because you'll find sooner or later, trust me, that rural Ireland isn't a far cry behind travellers when it comes to the same attitude. So yeah, I think our ethnicity recognition is important, but indigenous.
Sheila? Yeah, just wondering,
I used to work with traveller women for many years in the south of the country, and just within the traveller community. And there was campaigning going on at the time of traveller rights, and the traveller women that I used to work with used to get quite cross sometimes in saying that the voices of the people that were being heard weren't true travellers. And that they used to get upset about that.
Yeah.
And that the people that were speaking to them that were actually being heard weren't true travellers. So just in relation to what would that, because as they were explaining it to me, I never really got it. What does that mean?
I can only partly guess what it means, but I would say there's a traveller woman, PhD Cindy Joyce, traveller woman Hannah McGinley, another PhD in history. There's Martin Ward, who has got a degree in sociology. There's a wonderful woman in that Nolan called Trish Nolan that would give you absolute insights that would blow your mind away in terms of their experiences, but in the same mentality as travellers, but yet personal. Why we get angry sometimes is the state says, okay, look, let's fix this problem. Let's hire some of these people. So they set up NGOs. So the NGOs are now telling us, look, we've been talking to them and it's a partnership and you can really trust them. But the thing about it is we have to do everything they want us to do before we could even call it a partnership. So we have to go to the schools, we have to learn this, we have to do this and this protocol. But how do you get critiqued so much? And now you become almost distant from your own community. They don't even recognize you anymore because you're talking exactly how the people kept coming to them and promising this.
It's kind of the Uncle Tom syndrome.
Really. It is an element of that. And again, most travellers, it's not deliberate, because I know travellers that have worked really hard and they've given their lives, and some wonderful people, Anne Joyce and there's Catherine Joyce and there's various other travel activists. So when they're in their mentality and they're fighting, they are literally fighting a state for better quality of life. They may not ever have the time to take a step back and see the broader spectrum of being state agency funded. But something like that, I imagine, anyway. See, I would say I only imagine, because if I go around talking what women know, I'd have to leave the country.
Yeah, but that is the
Michael.
Growing up in Belfast, I lived quite close to travellers the best part of my life, and I never had the same problem with the way you hear them talk about down here. And just in your point, if we're not learning about travel community in Ireland in history, the way we're learning about other cultures around the world, whether it's India, England, or whatever else, like I think the rest of the thing, but it's an absolute disgrace that we don't learn about people that live in their own country, we're born here, the culture, and but we're just hell-bent to learn about our culture around the world.
Yeah. Well, what I've noticed lately, Michael, is that there's what they call almost populist racism. We know racism exists for travellers, but it's so implicit as opposed to explicit. I know that's one way to describe racism one way. In other words, if my complexion was different, then I would fit the criteria of someone who might be victimized by racism. But when you have white people in the one country, and they don't want to see it as racism, they want to see it as like discrimination. But I mentioned the practice and the teachers, and there was laws that killed travellers, where they hired Irish settled people to track down travellers. So if you come across a big group of travellers in wagons, you were allowed to kill them. That was the law. If you came across a small group, you couldn't kill them. So it's complicated, but
Yeah, but it's problems too. I mean, the cultures.
Oh yes, sorry, yeah.
I mean, how is people going to learn?
I'll tell you the best way.
I know you were talking earlier today, Michael, about like the difference between the nationalists and the loyalists in the north, and how they emphasise on equality in the north. And you thought it had made kind of a different outcome for travellers in the north.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like growing up in the north, especially, I mean, basically two cultures, Protestant cultures, Catholic culture. And that's the way it was, you know. And I mean, we've been learning about that culture all the way. It's good teachers, you know, basically. But nothing about other communities like the travellers who lived up the street from it. And as you say, we're here hundreds of years.
Well, like I said to you, in 1963, we deliberately removed history. Now, the most important thing I'm thinking, right, on this, right, when we say we need to learn more history about another culture, I really genuinely think, and hopefully Tranvision will produce that, if we can learn more about our own histories, you'll see things completely different. You know, you would definitely learn about all different cultures.
There's a good question.
Why don't you learn your own?
There's a good question there, all right, in terms of, I don't think we haven't got enough information on, it'll be mixed up in the same thing. I would guess it's going to be mixed up in the same thing. There's whether it be trauma or whether it be denial or whether it be the state itself, it opens thorny questions to do with land. It opens a lot of problems, okay? But it's facing those problems. I think quite often they just kind of want to paper over it. And the 63 report, it does that by saying we're not going to, well, even though this, you would think this might be a historical problem on the surface, we're not going to do that. We're just going to try and deal with it and make it go away. They do the same thing in 1983, and actually recently they've kind of done the same thing again, where they've said, well, what we're going to do is you're the same somehow as Roma, even though Roma we know came from outside just recently. And well, you know, and I agree with that thing with Roma, but the thing is we can't just say that it's the same, because it isn't the same, and we know it's not.
Well, even more so, they changed Paddy Point, which is a National Traveller Organisation. Now it's Traveller and Roma Organisation. And again, it's a bit like the picture. It's to get people to believe and see that, okay, let's not get too excited about the travellers. Don't feel guilty, anybody. They're like the Roma, they're probably outsiders, and it's not their fault. You know.
Yeah, and it would go back to the reason exactly, and the reason we would reel off all this stuff about what happened at the beginning of colonisation is not to sort of go into a litany of disaster or to make people feel about, oh, that was terrible. It's not that. It's to try and understand that why is the state now acting like that, even when it tries not to. The law itself and the origin of the entire system, it's like you have a machine that's designed to do something. And this machine is designed, A, to replicate itself and replicate the law and the way the land is held. And it has no room, it never intended to have any room for Irish law, Irish systems, or Irish ways of thinking in that regard. Therefore, no matter, even when, best of intentions, if I joined it tomorrow with Bernard, we'd probably be doing the same thing again. Because we can't just, the system is constantly replicating what it was designed to do in the first place, which is not to give any room for mobility.
And at the same time, and oddly enough, because anyone that knows me, I'm slightly almost anti-Fine Gael, because I view them as a slightly. But I did, and the reason I'm saying slightly now is because I met David Staunton a while back, and I was I done an interview with him. The interview didn't materialise, but it didn't work out anyway. But I felt like I wanted to go in there and really kind of do this guy in terms of questions and all that kind of stuff. But I generally seen a guy who genuinely believes in his heart of hearts that he's trying to do his best. Yeah. I see with even Leo Bacter. And again, I don't like Billy Gates. There's a slight shift in...
I would say a key thing is it's not conscious in general.
Yeah. Are there any more questions? Yeah.
If any Catholic Church influence on politics, because I one point I saw that the Catholic Church had a very, very strong influence. And Catholic Church, more or less, to me, trying to keep them busy in their faith. That's what it looked like to me, keeping children in that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very much.
That would be intriguing, that.
One interesting thing. Yeah, one of the interesting with the religion was when they came here first, the Klan
system.
Well,
no, because they started in you would have to go back to the beginning of the system, Catholic, in 1830s. It's quite recent. But the Catholic Church gets into power over the education system in a deal with the state under Britain. So at that point, before the famine, there was millions of people. There's 4 million people speaking Irish, and the travellers are not so obvious amongst this enormous population that are actually very. Still living more or less all in big extended families and are across all the land here. And the Catholic Church was given the job of anglicising them, which it did with great gusto throughout the 19th century. So I'd say you're correct that the travellers would be one of the last remnants of when they started their project. Yes. It would have been.
Well, I was going to say much the same thing. If you go back far enough, the Catholic Church had a huge influence on Irish people in general. Yeah. I think in the 60s, Ireland were like living a couple of generations behind everybody else, because it was held back to restrictions on reading and books and so on. The other element of that, and I don't want to knock religion because I know that travellers are very religious, but when you have absolutely nothing, when your whole world has been decimated in front of you, and you have nothing but your own psychological feelings and memories of what culture used to be, religion was hopeful and helpful for a lot of travellers, but they got them from one step to the next. They might have put them there in some ways, but at least trying to believe it gets them out of it.
Okay, I think we have a lot of food for thought there. Fair play to you. Thanks a million.
Thank you very much. Should there be a rebellion or anything, remember, there was a settled person that